Go ahead today, and we're going to be talking about Apollonius or Apollonius of Tyana. That's right. So now, when I bring up Apollonius of Tyana, most people have no idea what I'm talking about. At least today, in the 21st century, virtually unknown. Apollonius of Tyana he lived during the first century CE. He was known as a miracle worker. He was known to have the gift of healing, in some cases believed to raise the dead. He was said to be able to still the stormy waters and to call out the demons, exorcise them. He was known to be a great reformer. He believed that religion had become too ritualistic, and he wanted to give life to it and to create a personal relationship between you and the divine. He believed that there's such thing as an afterlife, that we could live in happiness. And you can hear that maybe there seems to be a parallel with somebody else. Remember, this is Apollonius of Tyana, but in many cases, this sounds very close to Jesus Christ, living in the very same century. And you're thinking to yourself, I've never heard of him. He must just be made up, or he is somebody that is created in order to counteract or to challenge Christianity. But he is not. In fact, the interesting part is that Apollonius of Tyana was extremely famous during his period of time, very well known, not only amongst the literati and the elite, not only amongst various emperors and philosophers and thinkers, but even common people. There was a famous series of amulets that supposedly were created in connection to Apollonius of Tyana that we find in the archaeological materials. I mean, it's there, it's evidential. And yet today, I say the word Apollonius of Tyana, and nobody has any idea who I'm talking about. And so today, we're going to delve into his life and who he is. And of course, we're going to be looking into the sources as well. Now, I have to tell you that one of the most important sources is a thinker by the name of Philostratus. And he wrote a work on Apollonius of Tyana that was based upon many other works that were also written about Apollonius of Tyana earlier on. Flavius Philostratus, he lived in the 3rd century between 175 to around 245 CE. He is known for another significant work, and that is called The Lives of the Sophists, which he goes through the various sophists, the various thinkers, all the way up to his era. And he wrote a few other works that have survived as well. Philostratus, he was part of a famous literary circle and thinkers as well that were connected to the Empress Julia Domna. In fact, her husband was, of course, Septimius Severus, and her son Caracalla was also part of this inner group. They were very much interested into the occult sciences and philosophy and all kinds of ideas. And so this special circle rooted in Rome traded ideas and conceptions, and Apollonius of Tyana was very popular with all of them. In fact, we know that it was Julia Domna, the empress herself, who encouraged Philostratus to write about Apollonius of Tyana. Yeah. And she herself had some of the documentation that she provided for him to work on. And so there you have it. In fact, Philostratus himself uh, says as follows, and I have gathered my information partly from the cities where he was loved. So he's gathering, he's doing research on his own, and partly from the temples whose long neglected and decayed rites he restored, and partly from the accounts left of him by others, and partly from his own letters. Just by saying this, myself as a historian uh, says, well done. I mean, this is a nice diversity of sources that he puts together, and I am going to use him as one of my primary sources. But I do have to tell you, there are a lot of other sources about Apollonius of Tyana that I will also use, unbeknownst to so many people. It's hard to believe that he is hardly known today. Why do we not know about Apollonius of Tyana? Is it a cover-up? Are they trying to keep it a secret? What is it? And the reality is that because of the competition with Christianity concerning some of the central ideals and conceptions, there was a big attempt to cover up his history. And as opposed to me just saying something like that, I want to wait to the very end of my talk because I will need exactly the individuals who did it by name. So you'll know. I'm not just saying this. I'll give you the names of those who did so. Okay, so let's talk about Apollonius of Tyana from the primary sources. What do we know? So here we go. So we're going to go into the story of Apollonius of Tyana. So we put together all these kinds of sources, including, of course, Philostratus. And we're going to talk about his life, of course, obviously commentary. And then I'm going to go from there. I'm going to talk about his legacy and what happened to him and why he's not a well-known name today. Because if that name, his fame had been preserved to this day, I will have to tell you that this will be probably this group here will probably triple or quadruple the size. Although, thank you for being here. I'm just saying he was a very popular figure amongst all stratums of society. Okay, so concerning his birth, Apollonius, he was born in a place known as Tyana. This is a Greek city in Cappadocia, or Cappadocia. Cappadocia is just a very strange realm. You have all these interesting stone formations that were weathered away because it's made out of lava stone. They look like shapes of pyramids and pillars, and you can carve into them. And even today, you have entire cities carved out of the living rock and even underground cities. A very strange area. It looks like in some cases, looks like a lunar landscape. Well, he grew up here in Cappadocia. His father had the same name that he had. And they descended from the first settlers. He excelled in, they excelled in wealth, even though the surrounding families were also very wealthy. So he came from an abundant background. Now, Tyana itself is positioned right along the Cilician gates, and so, in a sense, guarded the one of the main highways, and including, of course, obviously the Silk Route and other roads went through this main pass. Another reason why it was a wealthy area. Today, it's known and was known at its time for its aqueduct that came from a spring. So the story follows basically to his mother just before he was born. There came a visitation an apparition from the god Proteus. And of course, Proteus, a very interesting deity. Proteus is known, of course, from many different sources. We know from Philostratus, mentioned, obviously in Homer. In fact, Philostratus says he comes in the guise of an Egyptian demon. She was in no way frightened, but asked him what sort of child she would bear. And he answered, myself. And she asks, and who are you? And Proteus was the response, the god of Egypt. So right here, you have an announcement to the mother of Apollonius that her child is going to have divinity in him. Now you can see there could be some sort of similarity, even have an announcement, right? So already you're seeing some comparative aspects to the Jesus story. Remember, I want to emphasize this, is that Apollonius of Tyana is an exact contemporary to Jesus. They're living at the exact same time. Some cases they'll put him, they'll say that, he's born around, 3 CE, and sometimes they put it back to 3 or 4 BCE, but you can see roughly contemporary. So now you have this announcement that occurs. Well, let's know a little bit more about this Proteus that now is going to be inhabiting the body of Apollonius. Now, Proteus is an early sea god, or god of the rivers, as well as oceanic waters. He is known to constantly change. Therefore, he is known as elusive sea change. Some say that that he is connected to the changing nature of water in general, of liquids in general. But he is able to foretell the future. So this God is able to tell the future. They give a little rote, he's also known as the first. The word Proteus, the name does mean the first. In many cases, he is the firstborn son of Zeus. Secondborn son, in some cases, he is the firstborn son of Poseidon. And I go, wait, Zeus, Poseidon? You're going, I don't know. Okay, let's back up a little bit. I want to make it very clear that in Anatolia, ancient Anatolia, Zeus and Poseidon have a strong connection to one another. There's an ancient connection. That originally it was Poseidon that was a predominant deity. And then when the Indo-Europeans arrived, then it became Zeus, and the Poseidon took the second seat. So, and it's fascinating because Tyana itself has a temple dedicated to Zeus, or I should say, a well of water with a shrine around it that is known for its changing waters in connection to prophecy. You're like, oh boy, there's lots of connections. So Apollonius of Tyana is born in a place that has a source of water, a spring that's connected to prophecy, that's also connected to Zeus. Yes. Oh, okay. You guys got it? Known as Zeus of the Oaths. It's also called the Well of Asbata. But at the same time, it is connected to other gods as well, ancients going back to the Hittites. And of course, you could see also earlier on, there's a Poseidon connection. All right, so here we go. So now it's time for the birth. Okay, so one little fun part about the word proteus. It is the root for the adjective protean, which means in English versatile, mutable, capable of assuming many forms. So, this idea even gets into the English language. It's time for Apollonius to get born. So how does this occur? Well, it's not a traditional birth, much like you had with Jesus, who is born in a stable in humble circumstances. With Apollonius of Tyana, well, something happens where he's not born in normal circumstances either. According to Philostratus, he says as follows. Now, I'm quoting, he is said to have been born in a meadow, hard by which there has been now erected a sumptuous temple. And let us not pass by the manner of his birth. For just as the hour of his birth was approaching, his mother was warned in a dream to walk into the meadow and pluck the flowers. In due course, she came there, and her maids attended to the flowers, scattering themselves over the meadow, which she fell asleep lying on the grass. So the story goes so far as that she's led to go to this meadow full of flowers, and to collect these flowers, she falls asleep. Thereupon, swans who fed in the meadow set upon a dance around her as she slept, and lifting their wings as they are wont to do, cried out loud all at once, for there was somewhat of a breeze blowing in the meadow. She then leapt up at the sound of their song and bore her child. That's what a way to be, your entry into the world. You got flowers, you got these swans surrounding you. Nature is alive. It does remind me the way nature comes alive. The story of Siddhartha, of course, obviously Buddha, where his Maya was leaning against the tree there and giving birth, and what happens is all nature comes to life. Yeah, we have the same thing going on here. So nature is celebrating the arrival of Apollonius of Tyana according to the story. But there's more. But the people of the country say that just at the moment of the birth, a thunderbolt seemed to fall to earth, and then rose up into the air and disappeared aloft. And the gods thereby indicated, I think, the great distinction to which the sage was to attain, and hinted in advance how he should transcend all things upon the earth, and approach the gods, and signified all the things that he would achieve. Wow, what an introduction. So you have this monumental epic birth with nature and swans and flowers, and then, of course, a thunderbolt proclamation. All right, so already you're seeing some connections. Of course, once again, the this thunder, the lightning bolt, connection also to Zeus again. But remember, so it's interesting that so Zeus or Poseidon, right? Or, of course, we have other words for this Zeus. Zeus sometimes Zouk Akrios or Argeos is another form that is mentioned in Tyana. But it's interesting that you have this concept of Proteus being the firstborn son of the All-High God. Do you see any similarity with Christianity? Firstborn, oh boy. Yeah, right? Incarnate in flesh. Okay, so you can see already where this would be problematic for many within a Christian context. Now, when he reached, and of course, everything kind of skips to the age of 14. With Jesus, of course, it skips to the age of 12. When then he reached his 14th year, his father brought him to Tarsus, to Euthydemus, excuse me, the teacher for Phoenicia. Euthydemus, it's interesting, Tarsus. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is that here he is in Tarsus at exactly the same time as Paul of Tarsus lived there. So now he's living in the same town as Paul the Apostle at the same time. Anyway, we'll just keep moving along. Anybody see any parallels yet? Let's talk. Maybe not. So anyway, Tarsus was very. It's a beautifully, beautiful, affluent city. Unfortunately, people devoted to luxury. Now, Euthydemus, he was a good rhetorician, and he started his education. But problem is Apollonius did not care for the atmosphere of Tarsus. He didn't like this location. In fact, he said that people here were addicted to luxury. He said there's jesters that were left and right, full of insolence, and and they were not. They were connected to pleasure, just the way the Athenians were addicted to wisdom. There was a stream that ran through the middle of Tarsus, known as the Salon, and he understood that along the banks of which these lazy Tarsians hung out like so many waterfowl. Hence, Apollonius addresses to them as follows. He says, "Be done with getting drunk upon your water." And so he wants to leave Tarsus. He then, with his father's consent, transferred his teacher to the town of Aegae, Aegae, which is nearby. He found this particular location congenial to a philosopher's life, and so he could more seriously study at the location known as the Temple of Asclepius, so which is, of course, the god of healing. Aegea is, and so there you have it. Now, what happens as time goes on is that there are others that join this particular school of thought. And so he had many companions in philosophy, specifically followers of Plato, Chrysippus, as well as followers of Aristotle. So he even diligently followed the discourses of Epicurus. He didn't despise any philosophy. He thought it all as wonderful, but above all, he loved Pythagoras. And it is Pythagoras who he connects himself to. In fact, unfortunately, his teacher, who taught the Pythagorean ideas and beliefs, was not a very serious person. And so, unfortunately, this man was Eugenius from the town of Heraclea in Pontus. And he said that, well, he didn't know the teachings of Pythagoras really well, but he knew Pythagoras just as he says, just as the birds know what they learn from men. For the birds will wish you farewell and goodbye, and Zeus help you in the like without understanding what they say and without any real sympathy. So basically, he said he was a great parrot. He knew the ideas, but in actuality, he just said the words without any feeling. When Apollonius reached 16, he decided, I am going to be just like Pythagoras. I'm going to do it. And so at that point on, he declared himself a vegetarian. As I said, he declined to live upon a flesh diet on the ground that it was unclean, and also that it made his mind gross. So he partook only of dried fruits and vegetables, for he said that all the fruits of the earth are clean. So now he's a vegetarian. Also, when it came to wine, he said, and of course, of wine, he said that it was a clean drink because it yielded to men by so well domesticated a plant as the vine. But he declared that it endangered the mental balance and system and darkened, as with mud and ether upon the soul. After then, having thus purged his interior, so that he's no longer drinking any alcohol, and he's now a vegetarian. He took to walking without shoes by any way of adornment. So now he's walking around barefoot and clad himself in linen raiment, declining to wear any animal product. So now he's wearing linen. And he let his hair grow long and lived in the temple. That is the temple of Asclepius. So he looks in many ways not only as a follower of Pythagoras, but you notice this by now, he also looks very much like somebody from India. And we'll go into that because he does visit India later on in the story. Ooh, this is a good story, is it not? Yes. So, so now this barefoot, long-haired vegetarian, Apollonius of Tyana, who's now a follower of Pythagoras, is living in the temple of Asclepius. And he talks about one story. This is where another transition here. He says, one day he saw a flood of blood upon the altar, and there were victims laid out upon it. Egyptian bulls have been sacrificed and great hogs, and some of them were being flayed, and other were being cut up, and 2 gold vases have been dedicated, set with jewels, the rarest and most beautiful that India can provide. Well, he wanted to know who's making this handsome gift to Asclepius. He wanted to know, he declared that this man has sacrificed more victims and dedicated more gifts, as if Asclepius, would hearken to him, would listen to him. So who is this person? Well, what happens is that he got his answer. He found out, and it was a very wealthy man, one of the wealthiest mans of the region. But Apollonius detected something about this wealthy man, who, according to the priest, never gave before. He never gave any gifts to Asclepius, and now suddenly it's in plenitude. What is it? What does this man want that he thinks he can achieve by bribing Asclepius with all these gifts? He says, it seems to me, O priest, that we ought not to welcome this fellow into the temple, for he is some ruffian who has come here, and that he is afflicted in this way in due to a sinister reason. What was his affliction? One of his eyes fell out of his head. What? That's right. One of his eyes just fell out of his head. And he's given all these gifts to Asclepius because he's hoping that Asclepius will give him his eye back that, fell out of his head. Okay. I guess I'm on a roll. I better stop, right? Okay. All right. So I'm always my best pupil. Okay. Stopping now. Let me get a lashing. Okay. Stopping the eye puns. So what happens now is as follows. He finds out the story, and it turns out, because he sent them away, all the gifts are sent away. The priest listens to Apollonius and says, yeah, you know what? I'm suspicious. There doesn't seem to be a relationship here with the God. It seems to be like you're just giving gifts. It turns out that this person was no good. He got married, and then he fell for his new wife's daughter from a previous relationship and was having a relationship with her. His wife found out, got pretty angry that her daughter was seduced, and surprised the two in bed and put both of her eyes out, as well as stabbing one of his eyes with her brooch pin. Okay, well, there you have it. So you got a good guy. Okay, so already you're seeing something. There's a few themes that are coming up here. Of course, the one is that Apollonius says you got to have a relationship with the gods. You just can't show up and give the gods gifts and expect them to listen to you. That's not happening. You got to have this relationship, and it's always up to the gods to decide. The second thing, which doesn't come out as obvious in this, but you'll see this later on, is Apollonius begins to disapprove of any kind of animal sacrifice whatsoever. He wants to reform the sacrificial system within paganism so that no animal's blood is ever shed. Now, this is interesting because it's fascinating that within Christianity, of course, the sacrifice of Jesus as the lamb was to end, in a sense, the temple sacrifice of various animals in connection, obviously, to appease God. So there's a similarity here in just a little bit. So you see that. And of course, within Jewish Christianity, with the Ebionites, there was a sect who believed that the reason for the crucifixion of Jesus was to end absolutely sacrifices in the temple, even though he's believed to be just a man, according to this particular sect of Jewish Christianity. So fascinating little bits and pieces here, and there's lots of parallels. Okay, so there you have it. Now, so now when Apollonius turns to be 20 years old, he turned this place where he, in Aegea, into a lyceum, an academy that was centered around various philosophical discourses. So now it's really becoming a school. Now, he returns to Tyana because he has to rescue his brother from his life. His brother got himself in all kinds of trouble, including financial trouble. So what happens is that Apollonius of Tyana gives up the majority of his inheritance and gives it to his brother, and then kept just a very little for himself, very little of the patrimony for himself, because he says, hey, after all, I never planned to get married. In fact, at this point, Apollonius now declares that he is celibate. Okay, so celibacy is now part of who he is. He's so adding to the list of who, right, of his characteristics. Now he's a vegetarian celibate, a mystic of some sort who's going about and wishes to reform paganism. Now, he also encourages monogamy. He says at one point. Now, what happens now as we move along is that this is here we go, another big moment. On one occasion, Euxenius, back at AJ, back where he was at, asked Apollonius, why so noble a thinker as he, and one who was master of diction, so fine and nervous, did not write a book? And Apollonius replied, I have not yet kept silence. I have not yet kept silence. And forthwith, he began to hold his tongue from his sense of duty and kept absolute silence. Now, all of a sudden, Apollonius has this vow of silence. It reminds you a lot of the monks, right? So he's not going to be talking. How long does he keep his vow of silence? For the next 5 years. So that's his. So now. Of course, the account continues that, well, through his eyes and his mind, though his eyes and mind were taking notes of very many things, and though very many things were being stored in his memory, indeed, when he reached the age of 100, he still surpassed Simonides in point of memory, and he used to chant a hymn addressed to memory, in which it is said that everything is worn and withered away by time, whereas time itself never ages, but remains immortal because of memory. Nevertheless, His company was not without charm during the period of silence, where he would maintain a conversation by the expression of his eyes, right? By gestures of his hand and the nodding of his head. Nor did he strike men as gloomy or morose, for he retained his fondness for company and his cheerfulness. This part of his life, he says, was the most uphill work that he knew, since he practiced silence for 5 whole years. So he's still very animated. He still gets his point across just by his movements and his gestures. Now, I know a lot of people just kind of pass over, but he's quiet, right? But did you notice something else about this passage? He is cheerful. He's delightful. He is not somebody who is really a stern, stoic type. I want you to remember that. He's not so serious as a person, but he's known for his smile and his goodwill and his friendliness. And that's important to know too. So, okay. So during this time of silence, he comes across the city of Aspendos in Pamphylia. I've actually been here to Aspendos. I spent some time there in southern Turkey. And he noticed there is that he found vetches on sale in the market. And the citizens were feeding upon this because the rich people had shut up all the wheat and were holding it for export. Consequently, according to Philostratus, an exciting crowd of all ages had set upon the governor and were lighting a fire to burn him alive, although he was clinging to the statue of the emperor, which was more dreadful at that time and more inviolable than that of Zeus and Olympia, for they were statues of Tiberius Caesar. In fact, there is a story that's even mentioned by Philostratus, is that Tiberius found a man guilty of impiety because when he hit his slave just happened to be holding a silver drachma of the image of the emperor Tiberius. So just by doing that, it's like you're slapping the emperor himself. So this is what's happening. You know, there's the scene, looks like the governor's going to be burned alive. So Apollonius then went up to the governor and with the sign of his hand asked what was the matter. Finding out, what did he do? Well, he couldn't say anything. So what he did is he wrote something down. He wrote down as follows. He says, Apollonius to the wheat dealers of Aspendos. The earth is mother of us all, for she is just. But you, because you are unjust, have pretended that she is your mother alone. And if you do not stop, I will not permit you to remain upon her. So he basically says, hey, you're holding all this grain because you're going to give it for profit to other people while your own people are starving to death. You can see right now, Apollonius is addressing the social system, right? The wealthy and the poor. And he is, of course, for social justice. He's on the side of the poor, and he wants them to not starve, obviously. And so basically, he threatens them, those wealthy people, and says, "Hey, if you don't loosen up, don't let this grain come forth, then basically you're going to die." The goddess of the earth is just going to take you off that earth because you don't share her plenitude. So, as Laurel says, smite those capitalists, right? And so you can see right there, right? Once again, you're going to see with Jesus also his heart. Blessed are the poor, right? His heart was the poor and the weary of heart. Apollonius is doing the same thing. He is strongly in favor of that. Okay, so what happens now is that he moves on to. He's still kind of quiet. He goes to the springs, the various springs of Apollo in a place of Daphne, which is near the great city of Antioch. I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, but I just wanted to mention the fact that when he arrives there, he does reform the belief system directly, but in fact, he kind of forms a policy here of how he's going to do his reform. So here it goes. I'll just be very quick about this, but I want to make sure this is where he decides to become an official reformer of pagan religion. Okay, so he arrives at this particular place at sunrise. Indeed, he performed certain rites by himself, rites which he only communicated to those who disciplined themselves for 4 years after a spell of silence. But during the rest of the day, in case the city was a Greek one, and the sacred rites familiar to a Greek, he would call the priests together and talk wisely about the gods and would correct them, supposing they had departed from the traditional forms. So basically now, from this point on, he's going to the various cities and he travels everywhere. He travels all the way to Spain in the west, all the way to the Black Sea region in the north. He travels all the way through Egypt and Ethiopia in the south. He goes to Babylon, India in the east. But if he comes across a Greek city, what he does is the first part of the day, in the morning, he prays to the gods. Then what he does is in the mornings, after he prays to the gods, he talks about the gods. But what he does is that he talks to the priests and he talks about how religion should change, how they should go back to the traditional forms, but also do so with heartfelt delight and devotion to really mean what they say, right? Now, so he's designated himself as to the Greeks first, to the barbarians second. What do you mean? Next sentence. He says, if, however, the rites were barbarous and peculiar, then he would find out who had founded them and on what occasion they were established. And having learned the sort of cult it was, he would make suggestions in case he could think of any improvements upon them. And then he would go in quest of his followers and bid them to ask any questions they liked. Now, so basically, he designates himself to reform and change the Greeks first in a serious way, and then from there to move on to those who are non-Greeks or the barbarians and to make suggestions. Once again, I know you see there's a connection here. In Christianity, you have Jesus who goes to the Jews first, and then, of course, the idea is to the Gentiles. Fascinating, huh? Okay, he goes on. He said, then he gives an idea in general what a philosopher should do. He says, for he said that it was the duty of philosophers of his school, so he's obviously founded the school of Apollonius of Tyana, right? To hold converse at the earliest dawn with the gods, talk with the gods first thing in the morning, as I just said. But as the day advanced, about the gods, and during the rest of the day to discuss human affairs. So there you have it. Okay, now, of course, after the long day, he was typically anointed and rubbed, so he did get a back rub. It's kind of cool, right? But then he flung himself into cold water, for he called hot baths the old age of men. So he says he shouldn't have a hot bath. He should just have a cold bath. That's healthy. In fact, he complained, like in the city of Ephesus, where he spent much of his time. He says, when the Ephesians wanted to stone their governor because he did not warm their baths enough, he said to them, you're blaming your governor because you get such a sorry bath, but I blame you because you take a bath at all. Not that he stinks, because he did wash every single day. But I guess he's against a hot bath. I like a hot bath. That's just me. But Apollonius just says, too luxurious. Okay, now what happens now is that Apollonius now goes to Arabia. He journeys through Palestine. He goes to Arabia. and he meets with various mystic communities in these areas. So he spent some time there. And then he makes reforms in those areas. He, of course, mentions their hospitality, the traditional hospitality of the desert, of course. And then, of course, moving along, he moves. He starts having follow him various companions or comrades. Heterus is the word, and pupils, homotheus, who were devoted to his attention. So now he's now having followers. Once again, just like Jesus, now he is getting disciples who are following him. Okay, so now he decides to make an extensive voyage to India because he wants to visit specifically those known as the Brahmin, and they're called Brahmin and Hyrcanians, right? But before he does so, he wants to study with the Magi. So he heads off towards Babylon. He does reach the ancient city of Nineveh, and he found an ancient image set up by barbarous groups dedicated to Io. And of course, he encouraged people to go back to their original worship, even of that god, which I do find it interesting. Okay, now what happens here? Sorry, I got to find this part here. So he moves on, and he gets to. Oh, this is great. I love this story. He gets to Mesopotamia, and he gets to Zugama, to the bridge that crosses the Euphrates. And he's asked by the customs officer if he's taking anything out of the country with him. This is customs. This is border patrol. And he says, well, I'm taking with me temperance, justice, virtue, continence, valor, and discipline. Now, of course, this sounds like this, obviously various attributes. But in Greek, all of these words are feminine words and are also common names. So what happens is the Border Patrol says, you must then write down in the register these female slaves. Apollonius answers, impossible, for they are not female slaves that I am talking about, but ladies of quality. Yeah, Margie says, these would never make it through the baggage check counties, right? You'd be in big trouble. But there you have it. You gotta love this guy. Okay, so he crosses over and he enters the land of the Eritreans, and they were from Euboea, and they were brought by Persian King Darius years ago, 500 years earlier, and they were forced to live in this region. And slowly but surely, they lost their Greek ways and became connected to the local landscape and their local traditions. So what does he do? Of course, he returns them to their traditional beliefs, and he also says that that one should not slay or sacrifice any victims. So he's continuing now to say, let's stop animal sacrifice. This is not becoming of our belief system. Then he arrives in Babylon. So he does reach there. And he does spend time with the Magi, learning from them. It's during this time in the conversation that he mentions the goddess Artemis of Perge, and a certain lady who wrote poems dedicated to this great goddess of Pamphylia. And then, of course, he moves from there and he crosses into India and gets to the valley of the Ganges and to what is called the Monastery of the Wise Men. He describes also a mountain region that sounds like Nepal. And the descriptions of his interactions there does seem that they are Buddhists in many ways, also of the Jain religion that he connects with. Interestingly, Philostratus, when he gets to this point of the story, there's a whole bunch of busy names, lots of names that he's unfamiliar with. And so things get pretty confusing at times, but it does seem that he did reach India. And then, of course, he goes back to Babylon, to Antioch, to Seleucia, Cyprus, and then on to Ionia, and spent some time in Ephesus. He also goes to Cyprus and spends a lot of time at Paphos, with where the famous image of Aphrodite is located at. Then he goes back to Asia Minor. He goes to Smyrna. It's interesting. Smyrna was this is in Asia Minor, it's very competitive with other cities in the region. And he urged these people to take pride rather in themselves and the beauty of their city. He says that for although they had the most beautiful cities under the sun, and although they had a friendly sea at their doors, which held the springs of the Zephyr, nevertheless, it was more pleasing, he said, for the city to be crowned with men than with porticos and pictures, or even with gold in excess of what they needed. He said that public edifices remain where they are and are nowhere to be seen except in that particular part of the earth where they exist. But good men are conspicuous everywhere, and everywhere they utter their thoughts. And so they can magnify the city more in which they belong in proportion to the numbers in which they are able to visit any part of the earth. So what is he saying here? He's saying, you know what? He said, why are you spending your time beautifying your city when all it is self-indulgence in many ways? What you need to do is beautify your souls. Learn to become better people. And so when you travel throughout the world and say where you're from, and they view your kindness and your charity and your love, that's what's important. You say, hey, well, I happen to be from Smyrna. That's what makes a city great, is that those Smyrnans are known to be kind, loving people. That's better than all the monuments in the world. Once again, I like his philosophy, although I do like, monumental sites too. Yeah, that's archaeologists to do, right? But then he goes to Ephesus, and he goes to Ephesus quite a bit. There is a plague. This gets him in trouble later on. There is a plague raging in the city of Ephesus, and there is no remedy to check it. And so they sent a deputation to Apollonius, asking him to become a physician in their infirmity. And so he says, okay, let us go. And forthwith he was at Ephesus. And then he therefore called together the Ephesians and said, take courage, for I will today put a stop to the course of the disease. And so he led the entire population into the theater, where the image of the averting god Hercules had been set up. Now, I want to tell you this. So Apollonius does spend a lot of time in Ephesus. This is not his only time visiting the city of Ephesus. But I also want to mention that Ephesus is very important when it comes to Christianity. It is. Of course, I wrote a book that talks all about that. That's so important. Of course, you have the famous story in the book of Acts where Paul is causing problems in Ephesus, and many think that he's turning them away from worshiping Artemis of the Ephesians. And the center of the story takes place, guess where? In the theater. Well, this is also a centerpiece, the same theater that the crowds cried one thing and then the other against Paul, the apostle. The very same theater is where this episode takes place in connection to Apollonius, and around exactly the same time. This story takes place during the time of Claudius and Nero, and it's interesting because that's the same time Paul was there. Same theater, two different stories. Okay, so once again, we're kind of matching up. It's also interesting that, like Paul the apostle, going from one place to the other, reforming, setting up churches, Apollonius of Tyana is doing, of course, the same thing. Now, the story goes, and there he saw what seemed to be an old mendicant artfully blinking his eyes as if blind. And he carried a wallet and a crust of bread on it. And he was clad in rags, and was very squalid in countenance. Apollonius therefore raged the Ephesians around him and said, pick up many stones as you can hurl them at this enemy of the gods. So there's this little man there, he seems to be blind. And Apollonius is saying, you got to throw stones at this poor little man. The people said they don't want to do this. Nevertheless, Apollonius insisted and egged them on to launch themselves on him. So a few threw stones, and all of a sudden, the mendicant's eyes opened up, and he wasn't blind at all. His eyes were, they said, full of fire. And he was blinking, and he could see. Well, already, he's already a fraud. So he's posing as a blind man. So that's bad enough as it is. But now the idea is he is a demon that carries the plague with him. He is a plague demon. And so they throw rocks at him and they cover him all the way up so he cannot be seen. And when they pull the rocks away, they don't see a man. They see a Molossean dog, giant dog, the size of the largest lion lying there with foam in its mouth and vomit everywhere. Accordingly, as a result, the statue of the averting god Hercules was set up over the spot where the ghost was slain. And so there you have it. So interesting is that now he is attacking demons. So so he's getting these powers of healing. This will continue as time goes on, right? Then of course, at Asclepius, then at Pergamon, he stays at the temple of Asclepius. And here now, he begins his healing ministry, healing many of the patients in Pergamon. And he also gave them proper instructions to adopt in order to have reliable ways of interpreting dreams that can also be involved in healing. Then he moves on to Troy, and he spends the night in the tomb of Achilles. And he also has a fantastic conversation therein, the shade of the hero accordingly. So he's talking to the ghost of Achilles, right? Now, of course, rumor had it that Achilles told Apollonius where he would find the statue of the hero, Palmenides. And of course, goes on. The story goes, of course, Palmenides was one of the heroes before Troy. He's fabled to have invented letters. Anyway, what happened though is that the claim is that Apollonius had met Palmenides already in reincarnated form in India, according to the writer Damis. So now all of a sudden we're introducing another idea, and that is reincarnation. So now we're talking about reincarnation. Of course, again, we know the Pythagoreans do believe in reincarnation. Now Apollonius restored the rights of Achilles and erected a chapel there dedicated to Palmenides. Then he goes to Lesbos, and here he visits the ancient temple of the Orphic Mysteries, which of course is connected to Pythagoras. And so he has himself initiated in the Orphic rites. Then he goes to Athens because he wants to be initiated in the Eleusinian Mysteries. And so he is there at the various festivities. A Hierophant there, the head, did not want to admit him into the rites, for he said that he would never initiate a wizard and a charlatan. nor open the Eleusinian rites to a man who dabbled in impure rites. So now we're having the beginning of accusations that Apollonius is a wizard. He does magic, and so therefore he is aligned with the demons. So this is where that story begins, and he says, "I'm not gonna initiate you in the mysteries." So how does he respond? Basically, he says as follows. He says, "You have not yet mentioned the chief of my offense, which is knowing as I do more about the initiatory rites than you do yourself. I have nevertheless come for initiation to you, as if you were wiser than I am." And of course, the bystanders applauded because he was coming here to be a humble initiate, not to be insulted. But he says, "You know what? I'm going to be," he says, "initiated at another time. And it is the son of so and so," and he mentions the name, "who will initiate me." And and of course, it's like, what? So he leaves. And the person was in the crowd. And that person, 4 years later, became the head hierophant. And he was the one who initiated Apollonius into Eleusinian mysteries. Interesting, right? So there you have it. Well, now we're moving to another area. I'm giving you examples of, because there's so many stories, but I give you examples of the big ones that demonstrate who he is. Now, while he was discussing the question of libations, there chanced to be present in his audience a young man who bore so evil a reputation for licentiousness that his conduct had long been subject of court street corner songs. Now, this man was acting pretty crazy. Apollonius at that time was talking about libations. If you want to know exactly, he was urging people not to drink out of a particular cup, but to reserve it for the gods without ever touching it or drinking out of it. And then he also urged them to have handles of the cup, and so pour the libation over the handle, because that is the part of the cup at which men are less likely to drink. Anyway, he's really technical. When Apollonius wants to reform belief systems, he's really detail-oriented. Anyway, this man starts to laugh, and drowned out his voice. And then so Apollonius says, "It is not yourself that perpetuates this insult, but the demon who drives on without you knowing it." And so all of a sudden, the man starts to act pretty crazy. He does cries of fear and rage, and acts pretty crazy. So what happens is Apollonius then casts the demon out of this man. What? He's exorcising them? Yeah. So, like you have with the life of Jesus, now Apollonius is an exorcist. And so he ordered him to quit the young man and show by a visible sign that he had done so. "I will throw down yonder statue," said the devil, and pointed to one of the images that were in the king's portico. And there it was that the scene took place. And so he cast out the demon, and of course the statue came over. And there you have it. Like I said, you just can't make this up, right? These stories. Now we got a few more examples, but I hope you're enjoying yourselves. So he does, of course, restore even very ancient mysteries like a Dodona at Delphi and so forth. In 66, he left Greece for Crete again, and he goes to Mount Ida and to the temple of Asclepius in Laban. He doesn't visit the labyrinth of Knossos, however. Some speculate because it's the center of maybe human sacrifice. It won't have anything to do with that. But when he goes to Asclepius and Laban, here there was a story, and it goes as follows. This is important. About midday, he was addressing quite a number of people who were worshiping at the shrine when an earthquake shook the whole of Crete at once, and a roar of thunder was heard to issue not from the clouds, but from the earth. And the sea receded about 7 stadia. And most of them were afraid the sea, by receding in this way, would drag the temple after it, so that they would be carried away. But Apollonius says, be of good courage, for the sea has given and brought forth land. And they thought that he was alluded to the harmony of the elements, and was arguing that the sea would never wreak any violence upon the land. But after a few days, some travelers arrived and announced that on the very day on which this portent occurred, at just the same hour at midday, an island rose out of the sea between Thera and Crete. Oh, it's like, what? What's going on? What's going on here? Okay, so basically, you got an earthquake here. Apollonius speaks, saying that there will be an intervention. That's what it really means in Greek. There'll be some kind of intervention, and tries to calm the fear of the multitude and from the ocean. And of course, he reacts to their misunderstanding. And as a result, he says, no, that we're not losing land, we're gaining land. It's quite the opposite. That the harmony elements are very important, but that the gods know what they are doing, and they are restoring the land to you. They are restoring specifically harmonia, order in the elements, that the gods do not simply take away in destruction, but they are also a creative force. So he turns things around. I thought that was pretty interesting. So what happens now is that he talks about wisdom. He said wisdom is a kind of divination. It makes one divine, makes one connected to nature in many ways. Apollonius was basically said that, understood that there is within us, now we're going into his specific beliefs, there is within us a spirit that is separate from our gross physical nature. And this spirit is the better parts of ourselves. It is that which is a daemon. And when it ascends to a higher level, the living person becomes at one with these higher powers, these other daemons, and then through them to God. And so one has union with God through one's higher spiritual self. So there you have it. So he's teaching that we need to become aligned with this higher spiritual self, this higher truth that is within us. All right. Well, okay. So now word gets through as we go through here. So Apollonius, he's reforming various temples and so forth, and he's also being accused because of his reformations that he is a wizard, a charlatan. So in 66 CE, Nero issues a decree forbidding any philosopher to remain in Rome. Now Apollonius does go to Rome, and so he's now forced out of Rome, and he goes to Africa, and then to Sicily, and then back to Greece. But he's finding himself under the designation of a wizard. He's going to be brought to trial a little bit, but we're not there yet. So what happens is that now he moves on to Rhodes, and he decides that he is also going to reform the Egyptian belief system. Now, he goes to Alexandria, and what happens is that he wants to, specifically to the cult of Serapis. So the high priest of the temple looked on Apollonius' proposal to make changes to the Egyptian practices with disdain, and he says, who is wise enough, he asked, to reform the religion of the Egyptians? And Apollonius responds, any sage who comes from the Indians. And here he says, What I want changed most of all is the ending of blood sacrifices. That's the most important thing. Blood sacrifices must indeed cease. Okay, so then he moves further south and he moves into Ethiopia. Accordingly, he spent the next 20 years of his life in Ethiopia. Wow. And he finds in Ethiopia those known as gymnosophists. And now what happens here is that he arrives at this place, those who are the naked. But of course, there's more to this. Now, I do wish we knew more about this particular community. This community is known as the Frontesteran, or the thinking shop. And these are like a collection of monasteries, and people are living in caves and shrines and cells, not far from the Nile. What I find is fascinating, this is the 1st century. Okay, now we know, those who study Christianity and others, of course, is that monastic movements grow out of Egypt in the 3rd into the 4th centuries. But we see evidence here of the same kinds of monastic systems earlier on during the time of the 1st century. Well, when we take a look at this community, we realize they claim that they are formally connected to India, and they had forgotten their origins. But the one actually says that the wisdom of the Indians were brought back by his father, who had been a captain of a vessel trading east. It was his father who told him that the Ethiopians were from India, so he had joined them instead of making the long, perilous journey to the Indus itself. But the claim is, of course, that these gymnosophists in Ethiopia had this community that he spent so much time with, were originally from India. And of course, there are so many connections that we didn't know of between the monastic practices that we see in the West and, of course, in India. And this could be an example of a direct connection, which I find is absolutely fascinating. Okay. So then he returns to Alexandria, and of course, he journeys about. And I do want to say that I forgot to mention earlier that, well, actually, I'll bring that up later on. Nero didn't like him. Well, but fortunately, Vespasian does like Apollonius of Tyana. In fact, he was emperor from 69 to 79, as well as Titus, 79 to 81. So what happened is that even though he rebuked Vespasian on a few occasions, especially that the fact that he rescinded the privileges that Nero had given to the Greeks. Vespasian rescinded those privileges. He rebuked Vespasian, saying that you have reduced a free people to slavery. However, Vespasian didn't take this too harshly. But what happened then is that Domitian, after Titus becomes emperor, and Apollonius does speak out, and Apollonius does find himself eventually on trial by Domitian. And of course, what is the charge? The charge, of course, is magic, sorcery, being a charlatan, and especially the incident that happened at Ephesus. But they couldn't find anything on him, even though he was thrown into a cell for a period of time. He was eventually freed. And then, of course, we have the conclusion of his life. Actually, to say Domitian's life, and then, of course, Apollonius soon after. So this is a very famous story, and it's found in many sources. As you know, as I said before, Apollonius of Tyana and Domitian, the emperor, did not like one another. And many people felt enslaved by Domitian. During his rule, he demanded that he be worshipped, in a sense, as a god. So, the day of his assassination in Rome, Apollonius was at the city of Ephesus, where he spends much of his time. And I will read the account as follows. Although his deed was done in Rome, the assassination mission, Apollonius was a spectator of it in Ephesus. For about midday, he was delivering an address in the grove of the colonnade, just at the moment when it all happened in the palace at Rome. And first, he dropped his voice as if he were terrified. And then, though with less vigor than was usual with him, he continued his exposition like one who, between his words, caught glimpses of something foreign to its subject. And at last, he lapsed into silence, like one who has been interrupted in his discourse. And with an awful glance at the ground, and stepping forward 3 or 4 paces from his pulpit, he cried, "Smite the tyrant, smite him," not like one who derives from some looking glass a faint image of the truth, but as one who sees things with his own eyes and is taking part in a tragedy. All Ephesus was at his lecture, very popular, was struck dumb with astonishment. But he, pausing like those who are trying to see and wait until their doubts are ended, said, "Take heart, gentlemen, for the tyrant has been slain this day. And why do I say today? Now it is, by Athena, even now at the moment I uttered my words and then lapsed in silence." The inhabitants of Ephesus thought this was a fit of madness on his part. And although they were anxious that it should be true, yet they were anxious about the risk they ran in giving ear to his words. But eventually, word became known. They were still skeptical when later on, when swift runners arrived with good news and bore testimony to the sage's wisdom. 30 days later, Nerva sent a letter to him to say that he was already in possession of the empire of the Romans, thanks to the goodwill of the gods and to his good counsels. And he added that he would more easily retain it if Apollonius would come to advise him. So Nerva, the next emperor, saying, "Why don't you be my advisor?" Well, Apollonius gives a vague response. That's because, well, Nerva doesn't last too long. He dies soon after adopting Trajan, who'll become the next emperor, and sometime during the reign of Nerva, also Apollonius dies. And that's it. That's the end of the life of Apollonius of Tyana. Or is that it? Well, what happens is now we have, of course, his death. The death story, there are quite a few, as you can imagine. So what are some of the stories? Well, we take a look at this, and some say that he lived to be the age of 100. Some say that he died at Ephesus, tended by 2 maidservants. And of course, the story is that one maidservant he freed from slavery, the other he didn't free from slavery. And of course, she's like, "Why didn't you free me from slavery? This doesn't seem fair." And Apollonius says, "There's a reason for this." And of course, later on, there was a person who purchased her as a wealthy man, and he fell in love with her, gave her her freedom, and she lived happily ever after. Again, weird story. Okay, so that's one story. He died. Another story is that he died at Limbus and entered the temple of Athena and disappeared within it. And they say that, in fact, that what was heard was the chorus of maidens singing from within the temple, and their song was this: "Hasten thou from earth, hasten thou to heaven, hasten." In other words, do thou go upward from the earth. And so you have this idea that he ascended. So, okay. And there's another, of course, that he does have a tomb in Tyana. So he did preach the idea. So I love these different stories. Who knows? But he did have a shrine Now, he did believe in eternal life. He did teach that. I know I'm running out of time, but he said as follows. He said, the soul is immortal, and 'tis no position of thy own, but of providence. And after the body is wasted away, like a swift horse freed from its traces, it lightly leaps forward and mingles itself with the light air, loathing the spell of harsh and painful servitude which it endured. But for thee, what use is there in this? Some day when thou art no more, thou shalt believe it. So why, as long as thou art amongst living things, dost thou explore these mysteries? And so he goes on. He does leave a series of letters as well. And of course, as I said before, his tomb is at Tyana, singled out and honored with royal officers at the time, and emperors loved him, as I said. So, okay, so I want to take a little bit, because I know we start a little bit later. I want to take a little bit talking about his legacy. Okay, so is that it? So we have this first century mystic sage whose life in many ways parallels that of Jesus. You can see that it's pretty obvious, in a lot of areas, checks the majority of those boxes, but he is a pagan reformer. Okay, so what do we know about him besides Philostratus and the sources that he quotes? Well, there was a thinker by the name of satirist, I should call, by the name of Lucian of Samosata, who lived around 180 CE, and he did attack a certain individual by the name of Alexander of Amalticus, who happened to be a student, he says, of Apollonius, and he declares him as a charlatan and a fraud. So in this particular source, Lucian is referring not to Apollonius, but to one of his students, but it shows the legacy of his discipleship that continue on as late as the 180s, which is the 2nd century. Well, then you have, of course, Apuleius. Yes, Apuleius. What? Yeah, who's a contemporary of Lucian. He mentioned Apollonius. Yeah, the ass. Yep, okay. Yes, he mentions Apollonius with Moses and Zoroaster, as well as other famous magi of antiquity as being important. You have Diochristosome, who wrote around 211 to 222, mentions that the Emperor Caracalla honored the memory of Apollonius with a chapel or a monument, a harum. So now we have a reference to an emperor honoring him. Then we, of course, go to Memorabilia, who flourished during the time of the middle 3rd century. And he mentions that the emperor by the name of Alexander Severus, actually placed the statue of Apollonius of Tyana at his larium together with the images of Christ, of Abraham, and of Orpheus. So here is this emperor who was in charge of the Roman Empire from 222 to 235 CE, who actually puts Apollonius on his altar, on his bedside altar next to Jesus, right? And next to Abraham and next to Orpheus as great men. I mean, I want to stop for a split second. I want to say, just by me saying that alone, a Roman emperor having Apollonius on his personal shrine next to Jesus says a whole lot about how famous he was during that time. And this is, of course, a contemporary source. When the Emperor Aurelian was about to capture Tyana, the city of Tyana, in 272, where he is from, according to the Historia Augusta, he abstained from destroying the city after having a vision of Apollonius admonishing him to spare the innocent citizens. What? Another emperor, right? There is Vossicus. He wrote the last decade of the 3rd century. Tells us Aurelian vowed a temple to Apollonius as a result of his vision. And so, in fact, Vossicus speaks of Apollonius of Tyana. He describes him in the late part of the 3rd century as a sage of the most widespread renown and authority. So this time, in the latter part of 3rd century, you have somebody who's a contemporary, somebody who's living at that time, saying that already by this time, this 1st century man is known for his widespread renown and authority, an ancient philosopher, and a true friend of the gods. Nay, he continues, a manifestation of deity. For what among men, exclaims the historian, was more holy, what more worthy of reverence, what more venerable, what more godlike than he? He it was who gave life to the dead. He it was who did and said so many things beyond the power of men. Wow. Wow. And he promises that he will write an account of his life in Latin. Unfortunately, nothing has survived. But so you're getting my point. This is not somebody who's a nobody. This is somebody who's like constantly front page news. He is an integral part of the belief system at that time. And yet today, hardly anybody has heard of him. This is outrageous, right? And of course, we have others too. You have Nicomachus, Lives of the Philosophers, and you have Periphery and Iamblichus. Both mention Apollonius as one of their authorities. Periphery and Iamblichus are neo-Platonists. These are philosophers. Periphery, who is an anti-Christian Neoplatonic philosopher, claimed in his treatise called Against the Galileans, the miracles of Jesus were not unique, and said Apollonius had accomplished something that's similar. So now we got a problem here. Now you have Periphery basically saying Apollonius of Tyana did the same kind of miracles of Jesus, and he's saying this in the late part of the 3rd century, going into the 4th century. So you can see this is going to cause some problems, right? Around 300 CE, a certain Hierocles, who was actually one of those who was the instigator of the persecutions of Christians in the year 303, wrote a pamphlet where he argued that Apollonius exceeded Christ as a wonder worker, and yet he never wanted to be claimed to be worshipped as a god. So now, unfortunately, now you're having Apollonius being espoused by some of these zealot pagans who are doing not so great things. So you could see where this is going to cause some problems. And Eusebius, now the Christian historian, will respond in kind to this. But he does admit, Eusebius, the famous Christian historian, he does admit that Apollonius was a wise and virtuous man. But he also says that the miracles that took place, he did not do. These were the works of demons and not God. I find it very interesting that he says he's a good guy, but his miracles were not from God. And so you can see where this could be a problem. Lactantius, another Christian writer, also mentions during the 4th century, also mentions him as well. And it says, of course, anyway, just basically, once again, it's this comparative aspect that goes back and forth. I don't want to mention everybody, but I do want to mention lots of names so you understand that you got so many people commenting on both sides about Apollonius of Tyana. You have Arnobius, the teacher Lactantius also brings him up. And you have John Chrysostom, who calls Apollonius a deceiver and evildoer, and declared that the whole of the innocent incidents of his life are unequaled fiction. You got Jerome, the famous Jerome, who actually takes kind of a favorable view of Apollonius, and basically says that he encouraged people to become better in themselves. I like that. So not all of the Christian writers look down Apollonius of Tyana. I find that fascinating, almost as fascinating as the fact that you do have people who do this. I mean, so often you think all Christians are thinking the same against Apollonius, and that's not true. There are mixed views. He is a controversial figure because he sought so much to do what is righteous. And so there you have it. And then you have like Sidonius Apollonius, Bishop of Clermont. He speaks in the highest terms of Apollonius. He says, read the life of a man who, religion apart, resembles you in many things, a man sought out by the rich, yet who never sought for riches, who loved wisdom and despised gold, a man frugal in the midst of feastings, clad in linen, in the midst of those clothed in purple, austere in the midst of luxury. In fine, to speak plainly, perchance no historian will find in ancient times a philosopher whose life is equal to that of Apollonius. Wow! Thank you. And that's a bishop writing about that. So, of course, Ammonius and Marcellinus calls him the most renowned of philosophers. Eunapius says Apollonius was more than a philosopher. He was a middle term, as it were, between God and men, right? He fully exemplified the more divine and practical side in it. We get into the 5th century or the 400s. Valusian said that there were many people who almost worship Apollonius of Tyana as a supernatural being. Cassiodorus also mentions him by name. I mean, it goes on and on. But then we have the popular culture. I cannot end this talk without saying that the common people loved him. But how do we know that? Well, we also know that he became connected with the popular magic at that time. And there are various talismans that were connected to him. You're going to have a work. Of course, you have, for example, what's called the Pseudo Justin, his questions and responses to the Orthodox. This dates from the first half of the 5th century, and it features a debate between a theologian and a Christian on the talisman dedicated to Apollonius. Now, I want you to hear this. This is important. Once again, I'll set this up. This is a Christian writing. It's from the first part of the 400s, and it's talking about these talismans, these amulets dedicated to Apollonius of Tyana, these magical kinds of things. And it goes as follows. If God is the maker and the master of creation, how do the consecrated objects of Apollonius have power in the various orders of that creation? For as we see, they check the fury of the waves and the power of the winds and the inroads of vermin and attacks of wild beasts. So here we have that these talismans basically protect you at sea and from and of course the forces of nature, and of course diseases and from attack. The theologian responds to the question, which of course means that there's a belief that these talismans do work, by explaining that the talismata were not evil objects, since their creation was founded in Apollonius's understanding of the forces of nature and, quote, their sympathies and antipathies. So what? So, in short, while they lacked supernatural powers, they did not contradict the laws of God, and so that belief in God through them enabled them to work. What? So they're popular. So Christians as well as pagans are using these amulets. Have we discovered them? Yes, we have. I wish I had a picture. I actually made a picture, found a picture of one of these amulets. Yeah, they're found everywhere and they're recorded everywhere in literature. These talismans were extremely popular. And we have, of course, other sources like Nihilus of Ankara, who died in 430. He says in a letter, I have often told you and say again that the talisman performed through magic by Apollonius of Tyana contain absolutely no heavenly benefit, nor do they bring profit to the soul. In the life and miracles of Saint Thecla, which is connected to Basil of Seleucia, he writes, anyone who knows Apollonius of Tyana from those who have written in his life knows the disgusting and accursed talisman of the man's art and sorcery, his calling up of gods and souls, his summoning of demons and secret admonitions. So you're seeing now, as we're getting into the 400s, things are starting to turn just a little bit negative. However, not completely, because Isidore of Pelusium at the start of the 5th century says that he denies that Apollonius created a talisman. He says some people have deceived mankind with empty words, bringing in Apollonius of Tyana, who has produced many talismans in many places for the protection of dwellings, so they say, they can show nothing of which is that he is the source. And so he's saying Apollonius didn't create these talismans. And so this is the other part of the argument. And then you have Hesychius of Miletus, who reports a statue of 3 forks created by Apollonius in Constantinople as a talisman to prevent birds from dropping snakes into the well and poisoning the wells. And then you have Malalas, who says that the talismans are everywhere, he says, and he says they're against the north wind, putting this talisman at the east gate, another against scorpions so that they should not dare to approach this region, another against mosquitoes and so forth. So you see, and the sources go on and on. Wow. And you're thinking, how come we've never heard of this guy? Keep naming sources. Now you're kind of convinced and you're kind of like going, what in the world is going on? Yeah, I mean, it goes on. I mean, we have pages and pages. I won't tell about George Stanelius or Tzitzis or Zephilius of the 11th century. What, 11th century? Yeah, because he continues to be popular in the Eastern Roman Empire, which becomes Byzantium, right? And so, of course, it goes in. Now, he enters into the medieval world, but at the same time, versions of him go into the East and are part of popular magic in the ancient Middle East. Again, and of course, eventually, it moves into modern reckoning, and that's a whole other story, especially during the Renaissance. And so Apollonius of Tyana is brought in at the same time as the idea of the Hermes Trismegistus become popular, and they go into a Western esotericism, as well as eventually even into the Baha'i faith, known as Balinius, it's the Baha'is. And of course, finally, he is enshrined in popularity by Helena Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society as one of the great sages and a great thinker and philosopher. So there we have it. Apollonius of Tyana. Here we have an individual that most of us had never heard of before. And it turns out that he was very popular. But what happened? As I go over the sources, there's a few things that happen. For one, during the first century, their lives, the lives between Jesus and Apollonius, have many similarities. Of course, the conversation is how much of it is made up, how much happen to be accumulated layers of beliefs and traditions. Well, the best way to answer this question is to say that just like humanity, we are ones to tell a good story and have that story change as time goes on from one person to the other. So we cannot exactly understand excuse me, the accumulation of information, but we can understand human nature. And we do understand that there needed to be reform, not only within Judaism during the first century, there needed to be reform within paganism. It turns out that many had lost their way and were becoming absorbed in the material life of the Roman Empire. And they no longer seemed to value God above or the gods above. And so there was a space, a place for reformers of this sort rise up and to bring people back into a connection with God or the gods. And that the distractions that had filled many people's lives needed to again be cleansed and clarified to follow one's heart as opposed to following the needs of the many. And you also have, on top of that, you have this problem when it comes to those who are suffering on the lower classes. Both Jesus and Apollonius appealed to these lower classes. So this is all good. But the problem is, and I don't have to go do my talk all over again. The problem is the needs both amongst within Judaism as well as within paganism happen to be parallel in many ways. And so you have many similarities of a need for somebody to remedy or heal these problems, these potential problems. But when we get into the latter part of the 3rd century, you're going to have the difficulty of when they start directly comparing the two, Jesus and Apollonius. This is where the problem begins. This is where, because Apollonius was extremely well known. But we get into the 4th century, it seems to be a contest then between those who believe in Jesus and those who believe in Apollonius of Tyana. And many pagans, as well as Christians, do not know which side to take. In many cases, many of the Christians do see Apollonius as a good man. But many others see him, because he's competition to Jesus, that his memory needs to be condemned at all costs. By the time we get into the 500s, even though you do have positive reviews, for the most part, it starts to become negative. As Christianity takes over the Roman Empire, and as the pagan elements decrease, Apollonius of Tyana subsequently becomes less and less popular and demonized to the point where he enters obscurity and only known amongst the intellectual sort within the Byzantine Empire. Although his amulets survive in popular culture during the 3rd, 4th, 5th, into the 6th century, even within popular culture, they also start to decrease. And so again, the very reason why we do not know Apollonius of Tyana today has to do with its perceived competition with Christianity, because it is a little too close. Makes sense? And so you have now been initiated into the mysteries of Apollonius of Tyana, and I'm hoping that I have whetted your appetites so that you may want to do more research on your own. And I do recommend by starting out by reading Philostratus' Life of Apollonius of Tyana. That's a perfect way to start and go from there. Thank you so much.